Good day. In this program, I'm going to focus to the extent that I can on the looming crisis between the United States and China over Taiwan. And I'm going to focus in particular on the really most extraordinary telephone conversation between President Xi Jinping of China and President Biden of the United States. But before I get to that topic, I will first deal, as I must, with the ongoing crisis, which is the crisis in Ukraine. And I'm going to focus in this program principally on the military developments there. Now, it's clear that the operational pause, if you like, whatever it was, the period of regrouping that the Russians engaged in after their capture of the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation and their clearing of Lugansk region of Ukrainian troops, that operational pause has ended and ended completely. We now have information that Russian artillery strikes on Ukrainian forces in the remaining Ukrainian-controlled areas of the Donbass, now entirely confined to Donetsk region, that our Russian artillery strikes are not just as intense as ever, they are more intense than they have ever been. I say that because there was a report from the BBC that a Ukrainian soldier apparently told a BBC correspondent that Russian artillery strikes had declined in intensity. This was clearly reporting information from a few days ago during the so-called operational pause. And we've also been hearing all these reports and all these stories about the Russians having suffered losses in terms of their ammunition depots as a result of strikes by Ukrainian HIMARS missiles. Well, I'm afraid recent days have corrected that picture with a vengeance. It seems that Russian artillery strikes are now of an almost overwhelming intensity. And there is reports that at least one Ukrainian military formation, an entire brigade by some accounts, found the density of Russian artillery strikes more than it could bear, and that it retreated from the front lines in disregard of orders from the military authorities in Kiev. Now, again, this report comes from Russian sources, but it appears to be corroborated by events on the ground. And maybe it wasn't a brigade, maybe it was a smaller unit. But in any event, there is no doubt at all that Russian artillery strikes have been of unparalleled intensity. And over the last couple of hours, we've been getting reports, more and more reports, of heavy fighting as Russian troops push hard against Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. And it's very, very difficult to get a completely accurate picture of the situation. If you want to get an accurate picture, the place to go to is the military summary channel. The person who runs it, Dima, sizes up all the various claims and counterclaims with great skill. And of course, he provides very interesting maps, and he also shows us the location of the Ukrainian units that are coming under Russian attack. And the long and the short of it is that the Russians seem to be now pushing hard against the southern part of the Ukrainian line from Siversk to Bakhmut, which is shielding the Ukrainian forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. There's information, there's reports that street fighting has now begun in Soledar. This is the suburb of the town of Bakhmut, which is the southern axis of this defense line, and that the Russians have reached the outskirts of Bakhmut itself, and that they've taken all the land, all the territory between their original starting lines and Bakhmut, and that they seem to be preparing to storm Bakhmut itself. Further north in Siversk, it's positional battles And the military summary channel says that between the northern part of this defense line in Siversk and the southern part of the defense line around Bakhmut and Solidar, there's a large grouping of Ukrainian infantry, large numbers of Ukrainian infantry formations. It seems to me that with the Russians now enveloping Bakhmut and cracking through Solidar, and with the northern part of this defense line, Siversk, under intense pressure, the risk is that these infantry forces, these Ukrainian infantry forces, which lie between Siversk and Solidar and Bakhmut, could be caught in some kind of a pincer movement. And given that they're apparently infantry, they may not be that mobile. And there's a real danger now, or at least so it seems to my untutored and non-military eyes, that a very significant cauldron or encirclement of perhaps thousands of Ukrainian troops might be at risk of happening in this part of the front. And of course, further south, perhaps the even more dramatic news is that the Russians are continuing their attacks along the fortified border areas opposite Donetsk. These were the most fortified, heavily fortified areas of the Ukrainian lines in Donbass. Yesterday, I said that the Russians had punched one hole through this defense line. It now seems that they might have punched another hole, and it looks as if this defense line, while not yet broken, may be starting to crack. Now, this, by the way, is the part of the front where the shelling, the Russian shelling and the Russian bombing, the Russian Air Force has apparently been heavily engaged in bombing raids over this part of the front line, that this is the part of the front line where that Ukrainian brigade or battalion or company or whatever it was apparently pulled out of the front lines without orders because it couldn't endure the intensity of the Russian shelling. So it looks altogether like a very grim picture for Ukraine in Donbass. Now, there are some unanswered questions about all of this, one of which is how has it proved possible for the Russians to punch through this heavily fortified line of the Ukrainians created opposite Donetsk city? It was widely expected that this line would hold and that the Russians would not attack it, because doing so would be all but impossible because of the very heavy fortifications that the Ukrainians had built up around there. Why did the Russians change their mind, and why have they been able, or so it seems, reports are vague, pointing towards, as I said, significant Russian advances. Why has it been possible for the Russians to punch holes successfully through these defense lines? Well, the answer is I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm going to venture a guess. We've been hearing reports over the last few weeks that in preparation for the offensive in Kherson region, Ukraine has been redeploying troops from Donbass to the Kherson front. And the question is, where have those troops come from? Now, it doesn't seem as if they've come from the area of the Siversk, Bakhmut defense line. On the contrary, Ukraine, to the extent that it can, appears to have been reinforcing this defense line. And it doesn't seem that they came either from the other grouping, the main grouping, in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So that leaves, or so it seems to me, this fortified area opposite Donetsk city. In other words, the Ukrainians, perhaps relying on the strength of the fortifications in this area, relying on that strength of these fortifications, may have, I stress may have, because I don't know this, may have redeployed infantry and artillery from opposite Donetsk city. They may have redeployed it to Kherson region in order to launch this offensive in Kherson region. And this reminds me of a comment made by a British intelligence officer a couple of days ago. He said that the Russians have run out of steam. The Russian offensive had run out of steam in Donbass, and this gave the Ukrainians a good opportunity to go on the offensive elsewhere, presumably in Kherson region. And I said at the time that this appeared to be an attempt to push the Ukrainians into launching an offensive in Kherson region. And I wonder whether, on the wrong assumption, that the Russians had run out of steam in Donbass, the Ukrainians stripped their forces along the most heavily fortified part of the defense line opposite Donetsk city, thinking that the Russians were no longer able to launch an offensive there, and redeployed some of the forces that they had along this defense line to Kherson region in preparation for that offensive. I want to stress this is entirely my own guess. I've not seen anyone else suggest this, but it would explain why the Russians, who are very well informed, as is now clear, of what the situation is on the Ukrainian front lines, it would explain why the Russians decided that this was their opportunity to attack Ukrainian forces along this defense line and have been able to punch through, because the Ukrainian forces there have been reduced in number. Infantry has been redeployed to Kherson region, and artillery has also been redeployed from this area to Kherson region as well. If I'm right in all of this, then it looks like a tragic blunder. And I say that because there's now increasing indications that the Kherson offensive, which we've been hearing so much about, which the British media has been talking up relentlessly, that's not going particularly well. Now, yesterday I said that there'd been some reports that the Ukrainian advance up to the Ingulets River, across the Ingulets River, the setting up of the pontoon bridges and all of that had been thrown back by Russian forces. Now, that wasn't clear when I said that yesterday, but now I think the information that's coming through makes it indisputable that that is exactly what happened. This Ukrainian advance, which some people had thought was the opening round in the Great Kherson counteroffensive, the Ukrainian troops were caught in the open. They were attacked by Russian paratroopers, backed by artillery and Russian aircraft, and the Ukrainians were thrown back with apparently very heavy losses. And it seems that some Ukrainian sources have been trying to explain what looks like a debacle by saying that this was not, in fact, intended to be the start of some offensive towards Kherson, that it was instead just a reconnaissance in force. Well, if so, it's a reconnaissance that has gone hideously wrong. And of course, we've also had all those reports about the attacks on the Antonovsky Bridge. I've made my own feelings known about this. I think that perhaps overemphasis has been given on the missile strikes on the Antonovsky Bridge, which, by the way, contrasts with the far more devastating missile strikes that the Russians have been launching against Ukrainian formations in this area. Well, one way or the other, it looks as if that the Russians are resolving whatever problems the resupply, the problems of the Antonovsky Bridge might have caused. They seem to be busy building pontoon bridges across the Dnieper River. I was skeptical whether that could happen, but it seems that they're pressing forward with that. and they might even have completed one. And there's talk that the Russians are actually planning to build around 3 of these pontoon bridges. And of course, as I've said already, the railway bridge across the dam, which is, I suspect, the major route for resupply for the Russian formations west of the Dnieper, whether that particular railway bridge is still fully operational. But anyway, we've now had a rather bleak discussion of Ukrainian prospects in terms of this Kherson counteroffensive from, of all places, CNN. And a CNN journalist has been to this part of the Ukrainian front lines, and this is what he has been reporting. This journalist has been reporting. I should say that the journalist in question is, well, there's 2 of them. There's Angus Watson and Ivan Watson, but obviously this is a team of journalists from various places. And anyway, this is what they've reported. Ukrainian troops claim to have won back some territory. They say they pushed the Russians out of 2 more villages in the Mykolaiv-Kherson border area earlier this week. Well, I said already that seems to have been pushed into the reverse. And then we hear the problems. But it is a large area of open rolling farmland where any advancing forces would be exposed. And the Russians have had several months to build defensive positions in 3 layers across the region. And the Ukrainians have limited assault forces. For much of this conflict, they have been playing defense, and that has degraded some of their best units. That's a way of saying that they've been subjected to heavy missile and airstrikes by the Russians, which, by the way, have been on an enormous scale. Weaponry provided by Western allies are, by and large, not designed for ground offensives. And the Ukrainians are short of air cover for any advancing forces. The answer is they don't have any air cover, and what they've been provided by the Western powers is artillery systems, HIMARS systems. They lack armour. And that leaves their soldiers dangerously exposed to airstrikes and artillery strikes by the Russians. And as I said, on open farmland, which is the open steppe land, they are, as I've said previously in an earlier video, Ukrainians are highly visible to the Russians and can be attacked here with great ease. Ukrainian forces have also been sustaining heavy losses in the south, though the military rarely provides details. There are growing signs that the Russians are reinforcing their military presence in Kherson, determined to hold it as a vital part of the land bridge to Crimea and as the peninsula's main source of water. In the past 2 weeks, large convoys have trundled west from Mariupol through Melitopol to Kherson. An armoured, and we have a picture of an armoured truck emblazoned with a pro-Russian Z symbol parked near Kherson's former regional council building in Kherson on July 25th. And then we go on to read that Ukraine's southern front begins near Mykolaiv, a port city in the north of Russian-held Kherson city. To the north of Russian-held Kherson city, it is struck by missiles and rockets almost every day. To the south and east, a meandering front line runs with the Black Sea coast through farmland up to Zaporozhye region. This area is a long way from the calcified Donetsk front. It's not calcified, as I've just explained. There we go. Along the line, artillery pieces face off in battles. One Ukrainian soldier described as ping pong with cannons. It has been that way for months. And then there's talk about how the Russians have managed to make some progress. But then and let's talk about the bridge, the attacks on the Antonovsky Bridge. But then the article then goes on to say the Russians still control large areas to the northeast of the city and may be able to resupply forces on the West Bank with pontoon bridges and river ferries across the Dnipro. And more Russian hardware will replace what is lost. CNN has obtained video footage taken by partisans, Ukrainian spies, showing S-300 missiles at Jankoy railway station in occupied Crimea. Satellite imaging and analysis provided by Maxar indicates as many as 50 S-300 missiles on rail cars at the station on Thursday, 21st July. Just one S-300 could destroy a building somewhere in Ukraine. Unlikely. The S-300 is an anti-aircraft missile. Maybe CNN is confusing S-300 systems with Iskander missiles, but who knows? Yet, despite the enormity of the Russian war machine, Ukraine's military leaders have said this month strikes on Russian stores and resupply routes could turn the tide of the battle. Now multiple frontline soldiers have backed that up, telling CNN they believe the Russians have noticeably fewer rounds to fire on them. We had about 2 to 3 weeks when they didn't have enough ammunition to fight us with artillery, rockets and so on. But then we then go to hear that it will be a long fight. In the southern industrial city of Kryvyi Rog, Ukrainian forces are put through their paces. Reservists and National Guardsmen armed with pellet guns must storm a house, and let's talk about all of that. And that for the time being, the fight on the southern front is dominated not by artillery, but is dominated by artillery, not by street combat. Ukrainians say the future will bring an assault on Kherson, but first the long-range battle must be waged and won. So, in other words, there's not going to be a Ukrainian ground offensive on Kherson city anytime soon, when the Ukrainians are suffering heavy losses. As I've said, we've just heard that a Ukrainian advance to across the Ingulets River has been thrown back with heavy losses, and the Russians are reinforcing. And they may be able, with these pontoon bridges and these ferries, to keep their troops resupplied across the Dnieper River. Well, if this is all true, and this is all from CNN, notice the attempted spin, making it all seem more optimistic than it perhaps is. But if this is all true, then the Donbass front has been stripped of men and machines, leaving it weak and vulnerable in preparation for an offensive which hasn't yet begun, may never happen, and where CNN speaks of the Ukrainians being short of troops, short of armour, having to cross rolling farmland, exposed to attack by Russian artillery, Russian missiles, Russian aircraft, and facing what could very well be Russian armoured infantry able to continue to receive reinforcements across the Dnieper River. So, a misconceived strategy, quite possibly. I again say, I'm not a military person, but not for the first time. I do wonder whether Ukraine is doing things in a sensible way. Anyway, that's where we are. A real, ongoing Russian offensive in Donbass, gaining ground, punching through Ukrainian fortified defense lines, inflicting heavy losses on Ukrainian troops, cracking defense lines both along the Siversk, Bakhmut line and opposite Donetsk. What looks to me like a real possibility of a large group of Ukrainian infantry, perhaps perhaps being encircled, and a very real prospect of a culminating battle in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk before very long. And at the same time, a Ukrainian counteroffensive towards Kherson region, which even according to CNN, faces problems which may be insuperable, and with Ukraine lacking infantry, lacking armor, lacking air support and air cover, and talking about an offensive over rolling farmland where they would be desperately vulnerable to Russian counterattacks and Russian artillery and missile and airstrikes. Let's go to the big story, which is the situation between the United States and China. And there's now been a conversation between the Chinese and the US presidents. And this took place yesterday. According to the Chinese calendar, that was the 29th of July. I'm going to read the entirety of the Chinese readout. And it's the focus, as we're going to see, is Taiwan. And it's really extraordinarily harsh. President Xi Jinping spoke with US President Joe Biden on the phone at the request of the latter. Now, I've discussed many times in many programs how when a readout says that one side asked for the conversation, it's already setting you up for an indication that the side that's reporting the conversation and mentions the fact that it was the other side that asked for the conversation, it's setting you up for the fact that the conversation was tough and that the side that's reporting the conversation, in this case the Chinese, gave a strong and firm lecture to the other. And then we have confirmation of that. The two presidents had a candid communication and exchange on China-US relations and issues of interest. Candid. Now, during the Cold War, it became the practice in readouts issued especially by the Soviets, to convey the tone of conversations through these sort of words. And the words frank and full discussion, when they were used by the Soviets, basically confirmed that there'd been a row, or at least something very close to a row. And what would originally started with Soviet practice has been adopted increasingly by others, and it's been adopted by the Chinese, because here we see a candid communication and exchange, very like that old expression of the Soviets, full and frank discussion. Candid, another word for frank, and exchange on China-US relations and issues of interest. So nothing friendly, nothing warm about this call. Perhaps there was no shouting, there was no direct arguing. That isn't the Chinese style at all. The Chinese don't bang the table, but it's clear that Xi Jinping was in no mood for polite words. And then we get on to the rest of the readout. President Xi pointed out that in the world today, the trends of turbulence and transformation are evolving, and deficits in development and security are looming large. Faced with a world of change and disorder, the international community and the people around the world expect China and the US to take the lead in upholding world peace and security and in promoting global development and prosperity. This is the responsibility of China and the US as two major countries. Well, this is finger wagging. What Xi is telling Biden is that we have a situation of turbulence and transformation, and it's your fault. China is living up to its responsibilities. The US, by implication, is not. Far from upholding world peace and promoting global development and prosperity, you are undermining it. And then he went on to say the following. President Xi, or rather this is what the readout tells us he said, President Xi underscored that to approach and define China-US relations in terms of strategic competition and view China as the primary rival and the most serious long-term challenge would be misconceiving China-US relations and misreading China's development, and would mislead the people of the two countries and the international community. The two sides need to maintain communication at all levels and make good use of existing channels to promote bilateral cooperation. So, it's not the fault of China that things are going badly wrong. It's because the United States insists on defining its relationship with China in terms of rivalry and strategic cooperation, and this is standing in the way of cooperation and proper communication between China and the United States. It is the United States, in other words, which is responsible for the deterioration, indeed the wrecking, of this key relationship between the two most powerful countries in the world today, the United States and China. And then Xi, according to the readout, goes on to say the following. Recognizing the many challenges facing the global economy, President Xi underscored the need for China and the US to maintain communication on such important policy issues as coordinating macroeconomic policies, keeping global and industrial and supply chains stable, and protecting global energy and food security. In other words, translation into ordinary language, sanctions, economic wars of attrition are an incredibly bad idea. They are leading to a deepening of the world economic crisis. And then Xi goes on to say, attempts at decoupling or severing supply chains in defiance of underlying laws would not help boost the US economy. Translation, sanctions are contrary to international law. Only the UN Security Council has the right to impose sanctions. The United States and the Western powers, by unilaterally imposing sanctions, are severing and decoupling supply chains. They're acting illegally, and that's not helping to boost the US economy. It's doing the opposite. They would only make the world economy more vulnerable. The two sides need to work for de-escalation of regional hotspots, implication that this refers to Ukraine, help rid the world of pandemic as early as possible, reduce the risk of stagflation and recession, and uphold the international system centering on the United Nations and the international order underpinned by international law. In other words, the entire blame for the global economic crisis rests upon the disruptive policies of the United States, its policies of sanctions, its policies of unilateral actions, all taken in defiance of international law, usurping the prerogatives of the United Nations and above all of the United Nations Security Council, which is the only body authorized by international law to impose sanctions on various countries. And then we the readout continues as follows. And we now get to the really, really tough part, which is about Taiwan. And I should say in advance that this is the longest exchange, the longest recorded exchange that in a readout, that a readout, Chinese readout, has provided, the longest discussion of what the Xi Jinping has said to Biden over Taiwan. And I should say that it's fiery, it's strong, it's uncompromising, and it suggests that it is again the United States that is now at serious risk of triggering a serious confrontation. And I'm going to read what it says. President Xi elaborated on China's principal position on the Taiwan question. President Xi highlighted that the historical ins and outs of the Taiwan question are crystal clear, and so are the fact and status quo that both sides of the Taiwan state belong to one and the same China. The three Sino-US joint communiques embody the political commitments made by the two sides, and the one China principle is the political foundation for China-US relations. In other words, if the United States undermines the one China principle, if it makes moves towards recognizing Taiwanese independence, then the entirety of China-US relations, the importance of which Xi Jinping has already emphasized, that relationship will be destroyed because its foundation will have been destroyed. And then he goes on to say, the readout goes on to say that Xi said the following: China firmly opposes separatist moves towards Taiwan independence, the words Taiwan independence being in inverted commas in the readout, and interference by external forces. External forces is, of course, the United States, no one else, and never allows any room for Taiwan independence in inverted commas, forces in whatever form. So never allows any room. So any move towards Taiwan independence, any meddling by external forces towards that end will meet an immediate Chinese reaction, because China will not allow any room for that. The position of the Chinese government and people on the Taiwan question is consistent and resolutely safeguarding China's national sovereignty and territorial integrity is the firm will of the more than 1.4 billion Chinese people. The public opinion of the Chinese people on this issue cannot be defied. Those who play with fire will perish by it. Now that could not be more straightforward. Those who play with fire. Now this is obviously references not just Nancy Pelosi's visit and the US carrier, the Ronald Reagan, which is steaming towards Taiwan. It's making it absolutely clear that China is prepared to take military action. And that might very well extend to military action against the United States military itself. This is an explicit threat. It could not be more clear. And that's, of course, what Xi Jinping then goes on to say. It is hoped that the US will be clear-eyed about this. The United States should honor the one China principle and implement the three joint communiques both in word and in deed. Now note, it is hoped that the US will be clear-eyed about this. In other words, that China is not bluffing, that the United States should be under no doubt about this. And when the United States talks about the one China principle, as it always does, then it needs to act on that. It needs to say that, obviously in word, but it also needs to act indeed consistent with its words. And as I previously and repeatedly pointed out in their previous discussion, which was actually a virtual meeting, not a telephone call. This was just a telephone call, the one which apparently lasted for 2 hours. But in their virtual summit meeting, which took place previously, Xi Jinping actually said to Biden that on the issue of Taiwan, on the issue of the one China policy, you tell me one thing, but your administration does something else. In other words, Xi Jinping said, you're lying to me. And Xi Jinping again repeats by implication that very accusation again, and he says that the United States must stop doing this if it continues to say that it recognizes that it honors the one China principle. It must do so by deed as well as by word. In other words, no trips by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, no attempts to get Taiwan involved in UN bodies, no talk about opening a representative office by Taiwan in Washington, D.C. None of those various steps that the United States has been doing, in contrast, in conflict with Biden's repeated statements to Xi Jinping that the United States honors the one China policy. And then the Chinese add what Biden said. President Biden said that the world is at a critical moment. US-China cooperation benefits not only the two peoples, but also people of all countries. The US hopes to keep an open line of communication with China. Hopes. Not that it will take every step to ensure that open line of communication is maintained. It only hopes to do it to enhance mutual understanding and avoid misperception and miscalculation, and will work with China where the interests of the two countries align, and at the same time properly manage differences. Now this infuriates, I should say, the Chinese. When the US talks about working with China, when the interests of China and the United States align, the Chinese always say this is just treating China like a tap that you can turn on and off whenever you like. When you want our help, you come to us. When you don't, you feel you can be as horrible and as critical and as confrontational and as rivalrous as you want with us. And that's not how China works. You either work with us over everything or you don't. We're not prepared to be used in this way. So the Chinese, by saying that Biden spoke like that, they're again communicating the fact that they don't think he can be trusted. And then the last point, Biden reiterated that the one China policy of the United States has not changed and will not change, and that the United States does not support Taiwan independence. But note that he does not, the readout, this is the Chinese readout, does not say what practical steps Biden said that he would take consistent with that assurance. And then the readout ends. The two presidents exchanged views on issues including the Ukraine crisis. President Xi reiterated China's principled position. Both presidents viewed their call as candid and in-depth. A frank and full exchange of views, as the Soviets used to say. They agreed to stay in touch and instructed the two teams to keep up communication and cooperation. This is the most confrontational conversation, or at least the readout that conveys the most confrontational conversation between a Chinese leader and a US president since the time of the Clinton administration. It is the Chinese Xi Jinping clearly laying out China's red lines, giving extremely strong warnings to the United States, telling Biden himself once more that the Chinese don't trust him, and warning Biden that that the United States is playing with fire over Taiwan, that Biden personally is playing with fire over Taiwan, and China stands ready to respond. Now, of course, all of this is happening in connection with Nancy Pelosi's prospective visit to Taiwan. And of course, we don't know yet whether that visit's going to happen or not. She's on her way now to the Pacific. She's going to visit various countries. It's not yet been said whether or not she's going to visit Taiwan, but all the indications are that she will. Now, the United States, the US government, has been going through the charade of pretending that this is somehow independent of the administration, that Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. There's supposedly this division of power between the Congress and the White House, and that the initiative, Pelosi's initiative, is a private initiative. It's got nothing to do with the administration. Now, I've received all kinds of reports, the really helpful one from Garland Nixon, by the way, pointing out that as a matter of constitutional law, that is actually wrong. There's actually been a Supreme Court decision which says that because foreign policy is the prerogative of the executive branch, the president is fully able to prevent the Speaker of the House of Representatives from travelling to a place like Taiwan, and is even in a position to deny the Speaker a passport if the Speaker won't agree to that. But that's the constitutional position of the United States. The Chinese, the important point is to understand that the Chinese are not buying this claim that Pelosi is going there in an independent capacity. And we've actually had an article about this from Global Times, and it says the following: China's restraint has been reciprocated by the United States and the West with some salami slicing tactics. Pelosi is the third-ranked political figure in the US political sequence. It's the president, the vice president, the Speaker of the House. She is not a normal member of the US Congress. I'm reading again from Global Times. Global Times being, of course, the English language newspaper published by the People's Daily, the newspaper of China's Communist Party. She's not a normal member of the US Congress in the ordinary sense. The US Congress is not a roadside stall, not an NGO, but an integral part of the US government. The Speaker of the House of Representatives visiting Taiwan regions, no matter what means of transportation, no matter what name it uses, no matter what content it contains, at this moment in 2022, it will inevitably be interpreted by the Taiwan independent forces on Taiwan Island as the major political support of the US government for it. An extremely wrong signal will stimulate the Taiwan independence forces to take more provocative actions. The Chinese government will not sit idly by and let this happen. And then there's a same article from the Global Times then goes on to set out the kind of reaction that China might undertake. The United States must avoid misunderstanding China's strategic capability to defend its core interests. For the end of World War II, in the mid-1940s to the present, a distinctive feature of US foreign policy is that it is not sensitive to the logic of reason, but is very sensitive to the logic of power. Unless it encounters an effective interruption, the United States tends to extend its influence and sphere of influence to every corner of the world's power basin. The Taiwan question is the result of the US acting as the world policeman and wantonly interfering in China's internal affairs with its strength. The only foundation on which the United States adopts this strategy is the super military power and economic size that it once possessed. In March 2021, during the China-US Anchorage meeting, the US violated the agreed procedure and recklessly demonstrated that the dialogue with China from a position of strength was based on this misunderstanding. After the news of Pelosi's planned visit came out, columnist Josh Rogin on July 23rd published an article in the Washington Post to introduce potential options such as the US military considers sending aircraft carriers or aircraft escorts to send out indirect threats, which is also based on this misunderstanding. US professionals who truly understand the power balance between China and the US, especially within 2,500 nautical miles from the mainland coastline, such as General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have expressed to top US leaders euphemistically but directly the diametrically opposite view that visiting at this time is not a good idea. The anti-access denial capability system of the Chinese mainland has basically taken shape. The anti-aircraft carrier capability of ballistic missiles continues to mature. Large-scale military combat platforms and their formation systems continue to grow. At this stage, relevant people in the United States, including Pelosi herself, need to form a more comprehensive and clear understanding. Now is not the mid-1990s, let alone the 1950s, and the United States does not have the actual ability to do what it wants on the Taiwan question. Times have changed, and the dream of hegemony to behave randomly on other people's doorsteps without paying the price has come to a historic moment when it must wake up. The United States and the West need to be reminded repeatedly not to undermine China's strategic capability to defend its bottom line. So it could not be more straightforwardly said. China is not in the military position that it was in 1997, when Bill Clinton sent a carrier task force at a time when Newt Gingrich visited Taiwan. It's certainly not the weak country it was in the 1950s, when the US military power relative to China's was overwhelming. Today, China has the military reach and military power to take on the United States with some prospect, every prospect, the Chinese would say, of success near Taiwan. And this pretense that Nancy Pelosi is acting independently and not as a member of the US government by visiting Taiwan is a fiction, and the Chinese are not fooled by it. Well, the Chinese warnings could not be stronger and clearer. I don't know to what extent they're being understood or listened to in Washington. I very much fear that the neocons, on the contrary, have said to themselves that this is our last chance to somehow humiliate the Chinese, and that's why Pelosi is going to Taiwan. And of course, on top of all of that, there's this perennial fear that this is some form of bluff, and that the Chinese are bluffing, even though Xi Jinping has now clearly warned Biden that this is not the case. Last but not least, it's all now becoming disastrously mixed up in domestic US politics, with some Republicans like Mitch McConnell unwisely goading the administration into pressing on with this disastrously ill-conceived Pelosi visit. I don't know what is going to happen. I hope that a military clash can be avoided. But we are closer to that, a military clash between China and the United States, than we have ever been. If Pelosi visits Taiwan, and if China continues to exercise restraint in face of this, it will be for the last time. What we will see is a major stepping up of Chinese military preparations in order to, as they would say, free Taiwan from separatism, or as others would say, to conquer Taiwan and reunite it by force with the mainland. And that will mean that just as the Ukrainian crisis has caused Russia to deepen its relationship with China, it will mean that China will deepen its relationship with Russia, as it looks to Russia to ensure it for any loss of raw materials as a result of a US naval blockade, and will also look to Russia to counter US strategic dominance in terms of nuclear capabilities, an area where the Chinese themselves are working hard now to catch up with the capabilities of the United States. This is a disastrous policy. It's extraordinary that this fight has been picked now over Taiwan. People are entitled to whatever view they have about Taiwan. I understand there's many people in the United States who are very sympathetic with Taiwan. But sympathy is not going to help Taiwan in the event that there is a war between Taiwan and China, and one which involves the United States, any more than sympathy for Ukraine has helped Ukraine in the war it now finds itself in with Russia. This is absolutely, anyway, the wrong time to pick a fight with the Chinese. We've got a war with the Russians in Ukraine, one in which the United States is involved by proxy. Do we really want at this time, at a time when the United States is in recession and at the same time obliged to raise interest rates in light of the inflation crisis there, is this the right time to start a war between China and Taiwan, which might suck in the United States and which will lead to havoc in world supply chains? I would have thought not. It's astonishing that we find ourselves in this position, and it is a testament to the bankruptcy, the disastrous incompetence of Western leadership at this time. I hope we can get through the next few weeks and months without things going smash. It is an appalling comment on the failure of leadership in Washington that I'm far from confident that we will. Well, on that bleak note, I'm going to end this long video today. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, locals above all, but also you can find us on Rumble and on Telegram and also on Odyssey. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can also, if you wish, go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, don't forget to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button if you've liked this video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.